You have been listening to President Donald Trump at an event at the White House featuring oil executives from around the country. The purpose of their visit to the White House is to discuss the future of Venezuela and their oil production and whether or not American companies can get involved in the investment and the rebuilding of the oil infrastructure in Venezuela. The president has suggested that he is willing to invest up to $150 billion in that effort. They've also said, though, that any oil captured there would then be used to help the Venezuelan people as they rebuild their country. This, of course, comes after the president ordered an operation in Venezuela that secured and removed the leader of that country, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife, who is now facing an indictment and prosecution in federal court in Manhattan. Let's bring in our business and data correspondent, Brian Cheung, to talk about what we're listening to here. Brian, this is a pretty massive undertaking by President Trump to try and leverage the vast oil reserves in Venezuela through American companies. Just how realistic is it, and how could it impact the American oil market, and could it even impact gas prices, and if so, how soon?
Yeah, well, look, I think that we need to take a look at the events that are happening before us right now as kind of the starting point, if you will, of the American intervention into oil production in that sphere of the world. Venezuela is certainly, to the president's point, a massive amount of resource when it comes to oil. By some estimates, they account for about 17% of the world's reserves, but the production only accounts for less than 1% of the world's total crude oil. Now, how could that be? It's basically the lack of institutional knowledge in the country of Venezuela. During the Maduro regime, and by extension the Chavez regime prior to him, not just the United States, but many countries around the world sanctioned Venezuela and did not allow their oil companies to go in there and operate. And without the know-how to do so themselves, the Venezuelans were not able to set up the infrastructure needed to robustly extract the crude oil that they are sitting on. So the president's play here is to try to get all of these massive players in the oil space to assemble at the White House and figure out what is the plan going forward to beef up that infrastructure. And I think for that reason, I think it will be clear to our viewers that this is not something that can be done simply in a day. It takes years. In some cases, it takes decades to try to get not just the extraction of this crude oil in place, but also the refineries that are going to be needed to turn that crude oil into anything that could be used by anyone operating an automobile here in the United States. So for that reason, there aren't going to be immediate implications to the prices that we pay at the pump. And in fact, if anything, there's a decent argument to be made that in the short term, the geopolitical uncertainty brought about by an American government going in and essentially overthrowing the Venezuelan president is certainly actually going to lead to upward pressure on crude oil prices. So that is the near-term kind of risk here. But over the long term, if there is strong, robust Venezuelan production that ups the potential that they have, supplied with the massive amount that we're pumping domestically here in the United States, that could lead to lower gas prices in the long run. So that's kind of the long-term play here. The question is beyond Chevron, which already operates there in a joint venture with Venezuela. What other companies are going to go in there? You have ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips in that room. The president saying very clearly this meeting is to decide which countries they're going to allow in. This is the starting point in American companies going into Venezuela beyond Chevron, which is the only one that currently has presence.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Stand by. Let's now go to the White House and our correspondent, Monica Alba. And Monica, if you could pick up there on the point that Brian made about just how interested these oil companies are in actually participating in this effort to rebuild the oil infrastructure in that country. Is what we're seeing here today by the president actually kind of a sales pitch to these oil executives to try and convince them that it's worth the risk to put in potentially hundreds of millions of dollars for what could be a pretty unstable environment to try and get oil production moving out of there?
That's exactly what I'm wondering too, Ryan. And we have seen this with other industry leaders before, where the president sort of invites some executives to come to the White House, and then others feel the pressure of needing to be there, of wanting to be there, of not wanting to miss the opportunity to be in the room. But they do go in a little bit wary sometimes of what they're going to come out agreeing with, or whether there is going to be some potential pressure from the federal government. But this is a situation that's fascinating because you have the president of the United States telling these oil companies that he is saying essentially that they will deal with the U.S., not with Venezuela. He said, and I quote here, "You are going to be dealing with the U.S. and you are going to be not dealing with Venezuela." essentially he's saying, we don't want you to deal with Venezuela. You're going to be dealing with us directly. So he is now also trying to take this ownership sort of how some of these companies do their business. And there are a lot of questions, Ryan, about the timeline here. The president put forward to our own Kristen Welker in an interview earlier this week an 18-month timeline potentially to rebuild the infrastructure of oil production in Venezuela. We'll see if these companies actually agree that that is feasible or whether they are going to be invested in that. And then he's also been saying, the president has been saying, that these companies will somehow be reimbursed for their investment in this project that, again, could take a long time. And it's a little bit unclear exactly how that reimbursement process is going to work. And the White House has said that there is going to be a lot of private sector engagement from banks and beyond to try to facilitate this. So I think the question here is exactly what you're putting out there. Are all of these oil companies on the same page about the way that they want to go and do this business? Is this something that is going to be compelled in a particular way by the federal government, or are some of these companies going to decide that they don't want to do that? And what will that mean for them, their business and their bottom line? But again, this is a situation where the president has incredible sway, has a lot, that's why he likes to have these kinds of meetings. And this meeting was listed as closed press earlier in the day, but then they did decide to open it to cameras, to reporters, and that's not an accident, right, Ryan? The president wants this to take place in front of the world to, again, put out how he would like this to go, and then we'll see what the oil companies say. Again, some of them, I think, clearly praising him and wanting to do this in the way that he is setting it out, while others may potentially have some questions about how this is going to unfold.
And Brian, to bring you back in, this is somewhat of a big ask for these oil companies, right? We're talking about they're trying to figure out the cost-benefit analysis here of perhaps maybe even at the best case scenario, 18 months before they're actually producing any oil. Is it going to be worth the investment for some of them?
Yeah, and look, I mean, even aside from all of this, if you listen to any shareholder meeting in any quarter for these companies, you always hear analysts asking these oil company executives, how much money are you investing into R&D, what they call capital expenditures, which is the enormous amount of cost it costs to turn on a drill or to build a new one. What we're talking about here in Venezuela would be the massive costs of developing that infrastructure. It costs these companies an enormous amount of money just to turn on a drill that already exists. Imagine how much money it's going to cost to put them in place. Now, when it comes to the estimate, the president actually said $100 billion. Again, how eager will these companies be to do that? That is the open question going on from here.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.